Professor Wilsden is an interdisciplinary social scientist who works on the governance and management of science and research and the relationship between evidence and decision making. Since 2016, he has been based at the University of Sheffield. He's now in the Information School. He's a digital science professor of research policy and director of the Research on Research Institute, the RORI. This is an international consortium of research funders, academic institutions and technologists working to champion transformative and translational research on research. Co-founded by the Wellcome Trust, the Universities of Sheffield and Leiden, and Digital Science, RORI, will analyse research systems and experiment with decision and evaluation data, tools and frameworks in order to advance more strategic, open, diverse and inclusive research. So please take it away, Professor Wilsden.
James, I think your microphone isn't working properly.
Hi, Andrew. Is that better?
Yes, that's perfect.
Oh, sorry. So you didn't get any of that?
No, unfortunately, you might have to start again. Sorry.
Oh, no. Apologies. That's a problem of not being able to see what I'm doing. Sorry. Apologies. I'll start again. So yes, no, I was saying thank you, Jenny, for the introduction. It's good to be here. And sorry about the tech glitches. One of the nice features of the online world that we're all now inhabiting is that the departmental seminar, which would obviously normally happen in a physical space in Sheffield, can be opened up more widely. So it's great that others outside of the university are able to join, and I hope that this is one of the features of research culture that we preserve in the new normal that we're now moving towards. So my goal in now less minutes than I had before is to try and offer some initial thoughts really about how we conceive of the medium and longer term consequences of what's happening around us for research policies, systems and cultures. We've obviously seen in research, both at the funding level and in terms of dissemination, communication, a lot of rapid responses, a lot of innovation of various kinds in response to the crisis of COVID-19. I want to try and ask and at least point towards answers as to what insights we might from all of that to support the strengthening of research systems and cultures over the longer term. So are there lessons we can draw from this episode, which is of course still unfolding and may have many chapters still to be written, but are there lessons we can draw for the design of funding and review processes over the longer term and for research practices? And can we actually be using some of the innovation that we're seeing now in the immediate responses as a site for experimentation and learning? So that's what I aim to cover in about 20-25 minutes, and there'll hopefully be time for discussion, which we'll do through use of the text box, and hopefully also people can appear using their cameras. So I'm going to talk about what's our frame of reference here, the challenges of radical uncertainties that, of course, are still all around us. I then want to crudely divide these debates into inputs in terms of the kinds of funding response that we're seeing, and I'll talk about this in terms of 3 different waves. Outputs in terms of innovations in peer review, communication, dissemination, and then issues of research culture, which let me get rid of that thing that's appeared, which again have some more immediate effects that we're seeing in terms of differential rates of productivity, under the conditions of the pandemic, but also longer term dilemmas and opportunities. And finally, I'll just say a few things about what research on research or to research can offer to help us make sense of all of this. So starting really with this question of sort of what's our frame of reference, and I think it's still very difficult to get a proper handle on this in respect of research systems, as indeed for everything else. We sort of reach around for comparisons, of course, and there's lots of commentary on this all the time, but are we talking about an event that 10 years from now or longer we'll view as the same order of magnitude as the Wall Street crash? Of course, the economic effects are more serious than that, at least in the short term, from the data we have. Will it be similar, or are there valid comparisons to draw with the Second World War? And of course, for science research, it was World War II that really triggered the creation of the public research funding system as we know it in the modern era. And Vannevar Bush there in the US was the principal influence over there. There were equivalent innovations that took place here. So there were definitely big sort of structural effects on research that came out of the war. Is it in some sense relevant to look for comparisons to the ending of the Cold War, which of course in R&D terms triggered quite a substantial shift of priorities away from defense R&D and physical sciences associated with that into the life sciences and health sciences, and the sort of growth that we saw through the 1990s and up until now, and I'm sure will continue as a result of COVID-19 in spending on biomedical research, can in part at least be attributed to the effects of the Cold War. Are there valid comparisons from the more recent crisis that we can of course recall with more detail in 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, etc.? Again, I mean, the economic effects seem here more serious. So I think it's very hard to properly get the measure of this at this point. It is important, I think, to be looking for analogies and comparisons because they can be instructive. But clearly the potential effects of this are really very profound indeed. Whatever we may hear from more ebullient politicians about the speed at which we will bounce back. And I think we need to sort of preface our discussion around research and research funding with all of that in mind, because at the moment, the kinds of funding responses we're seeing are still operating in an urgent response mode, but still within a conventional economic frame in terms of the possibility and scale of investment, and that may of course change. I was very taken with this nice article blog post that my former physics colleague Andy Sterling wrote a couple of months ago now, about as the title says here, the futilities of control and the radical uncertainties that attach themselves to a situation like the one we're now in. And I've just pulled out a few quotes here, which I'll just skim through quickly. I mean, he starts this piece, rather as I'm doing with this talk, by self-reflecting on the fact that we're all, particularly in lockdown mode in front of our laps, churning out, as academics and pundits do, commentary of all types on how the coronavirus crisis can essentially serve the kinds of agendas that we have long supported, the sort of so-called coronavirus confirmation syndrome. And as Andy says here, the prescriptions that people come up with look remarkably similar to those they would have advocated beforehand. So in this sense, for all transformational language, it's in many respects business as usual, just with a new peg. But as he reminds us, of course, there are very real and significant human costs to what's unfolded, particularly in this country, indeed, relative to others. And those voices, those perspectives are often less visible in these debates. But what this leads us to, and certainly Andy's analysis, and I'd agree with this, is that at the moment we don't know the full range of implications of the moment we're living through, and a radical diversity of futures remain possible. So I think it's important, as I embark on an attempt to try and put some framework around this, to preface all of it with this caveat that we are still very, very unclear as to what all of this will mean over the medium and longer term. Coming back to the research system, there has, of course, been, as I said at the start, a lot of discussion about the extent to which COVID-19 has changed or is changing the way the world does science. This was one example, a nice piece in the New York Times back in April, which took the extent to which different research groups are collaborating with, unprecedented levels of sort of speed and agility as a starting point for a discussion of what this means for the future of science. And I think for funders, for research policymakers, for publishers, and indeed for us all as researchers, the biggest tensions here is how we marry the need to respond with urgency and agility in a crisis like this. And it's been fantastic, I think, to see the breadth, the range, the quality, the energy that's being put in from all sorts of parts of the researchers, and certainly here in Sheffield as elsewhere, to many of these problems. But doing all of that while maintaining core principles and commitments that we value within research systems. So quality, of course, fairness, rigor, diversity, and accountability. And you see that tension play in funder responses, in policy responses, and in the publishing side. And I guess the aspiration is, at least, is that when we come out the other side of this, whether that's sooner or it takes longer, for those of us who are involved and care about the design, operation, management, governance, ethics of research systems, we want to try and, cliched as it is, turn the crisis into some kind of opportunity to bounce back to something better. So to get into to sort of what have we seen happening? First, about funding, because it's perhaps the easiest thing to get a handle on. As I said, I want to try and tease apart three different waves of policy funder responses that we've seen to the pandemic. The first wave responses in this scheme would cover all of the enormous investment that we're seeing and have seen over the last few months in primarily vaccine research, but also diagnostics, therapeutics, the immediate health and care consequences and needs within different national systems. And this, of course, has been very large scale. I've drawn here, there are a whole range, I should say, of R&D trackers linked to COVID. I could have put 4 or 5 up. I'm going to show you 2. This is a very nice one, I think, that's been put together by this organisation in Australia, Policy Cures Research. And partly because it has these nice visualizations. And you see here the data updated as of June the 25th, so only a few days ago. And in their calculation, they have totted up a total of 8.3 billion US dollars being spent in this way on directly responsive COVID-19 R&D. And you can divide that both by type, using the categories there, and by country. And I've pulled out there the UK, so you get a sense, in their calculation at least, the UK has so far allocated something in the order of 700 million US dollars. So that's sort of one attempt to put a frame on this. The OECD also has a very nice site where it's pulled together emergency research funding initiatives. You see it there, the GSF picture up at the top there, and they also tease out these 8 different categories of COVID-19 research funding. So basic research, epidemiology, public health, clinical management, diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, technology, so this is things like ventilators and PPE, and then societal responses, and the last sort of starts to get us into what I'm going to now call wave 2, but still primarily immediate societal dimensions of the crisis itself. So how are people, you know, all the behavioral science dimensions of how people will behave, are behaving under different lockdown policies, and you know, issues to do with mobility, people crossing borders, etc., etc. A few more examples of what this looks like in terms of the first wave. Our own funders here, to sort of bring this back home a bit, have you know, as the big number at the start there from the Australians suggested, been playing a very major part. UKRI, as the main public funder, has I think moved with impressive ability to try and do 3 things simultaneously. Firstly, encourage those working in relevant areas to direct their current and ongoing research to questions that relate to the pandemic, so a sort of redirection of existing grants. Secondly, to put new targeted grants into the system in a whole range of areas, including vaccines and therapeutics, etc. And thirdly, and we have more detail on this over the weekend, in fact, to try and soften the negative effects of the wider economic turbulence on the research system by providing extensions to existing grant funding and other funding sources that can help research, whether it's COVID related or non-COVID related, to ride out some of the bumpy waves that we're obviously expecting to see now in the financial outlook for universities and well, the UK economy more broadly. So that's UKRI. Wellcome, of course, as well, has been doing very similar things in its area of funding, and I also here have highlighted some of the collaborative work that the Wellcome's been doing. Particularly of interest, I think, is this COVID-19 therapeutics accelerator that they're doing with Gates and others. This brings together half a dozen or so big global funders to try and introduce a kind of accelerator model that you see in other parts of the innovation system to this specific challenge of therapeutics, which, of course, as we saw with the one that was identified here the other day, potentially are a very important part of the picture, as well as vaccines. On the vaccine side, of course, there is also a lot going on through national efforts and through alliances like Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and our own funders, Wellcome, etc., have been doing a lot to try and drum up larger investment from different governments and from business in those efforts. And then I was also just kind of flag, we've seen a few other novel responses. I mean, you know, I could fill several slides with these, but I've just put one down here, this Fast Grants initiative, which was came from a small corporate private sector linked funding stream, but was trying early on in the pandemic again to foster in a very accelerated way funding for different research projects. You'll see that applications are paused because the volume of applications had exceeded quite quickly the resource available. So those are all what I'd call sort of first wave responses, and you know, as I say, I think it's to the credit of funders and policymakers and researchers themselves, of course, who are primarily bearing the load of doing all of this work, that we've all, or the community has responded so you know, forcefully and dynamically to the crisis as it's unfolded. Second wave responses are those, as I would describe, that are sort of taking the consequences of COVID-19, but looking a little bit further ahead. This means for the economy and wider economic effects for the health systems. So you're not here talking about the kind of research needs in the immediate pandemic response, but you're talking about ways in which the pandemic you know, leaves its mark on societies and the research questions that are associated with that. So I mean, just a few examples, again, one could put many here. NIHR here in the UK launched just recently, it's a firm that's been doing a lot of the other kind of first wave funding as well, I should say, but has launched a call for longer term COVID-19 research. This is particularly looking at health and social care system dynamics. Over there on the other side of the slide, the Volkswagen Foundation in Germany Corona crisis and beyond. So this is something that brings in the sweep also of social science, humanities research to think about what kind of societies we're going to be living in after all of this, and all of these bigger questions around, mobility and obviously the economy, future of work, etc., etc. And then in the middle there, another quite interesting example, the African Academy of Sciences. This is the sort of Pan-African national academy body, using COVID-19 as an opportunity to undertake a quite innovative priority setting exercise, looking at not only what is needed for immediate response, but in a way what longer term R&D questions fall out of this for funders and policymakers in an African context. So as I say, there's a lot, again, one could point to, and more of these now coming on stream as inevitably the sort of volume of the first wave response starts to subside and the second wave funding streams come in. The third wave is one that's certainly of great interest to us in the Research on Research Institute, and here I think it's a lot less clear quite what this will all mean. Beyond COVID-19 itself, there is, of course, a very strong case to be made and a very strong likelihood that we're going to see out of this greater emphasis on pandemics in general, so not just COVID, but other pandemics. And so the kinds of global initiatives that have come into being over the past decade or so in response to other smaller pandemics, but still serious, Ebola, etc., Gavi, CEPI, you would expect to see more money and investment and emphasis going into this whole area. And that, of course, makes complete sense. There is, of course, also, I think, a high probability that we will see a greater focus on preparedness and resilience in a more generic sense. And I've highlighted one example here of an initiative that has tried to do that, has been, banging a drum for those agendas for quite some time. The Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge that Martin Rees, my former boss as president of the Royal Society, set up when he finished his term as RS president. And that centre, also as its name suggests, is, well, as you can see from the slide, is devoted to the study and mitigation of all kinds of risks that could lead to human extinction or civilizational collapse. It's a cheery place to work. But I had a chat, funnily enough, with Martin the other day on email about all this, and he was saying, from his perspective, obviously, he very much welcomed any shift towards a stronger emphasis on these longer term, often very uncertain questions. He did, of course, he sort of wryly added in the, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me sharing an email to me about this, that of course, inevitably what will happen now is funders will pour a lot of money into pandemics, and then it'll be an asteroid, strike that sees us off. And so I think that's in a jokey way, as it were, sort of highlights some of the both the dilemmas and the needs in this whole area. So third wave responses, I think, are very interesting. There is, of course, now a whole set of questions bubbling up, which are far from being resolved in and around research funding, about, again, what mark this whole episode leaves on research systems. And we've seen this already, blow up in a range of ways. Probably most acutely, the big falling out that we saw early on in the pandemic, back in April, at the European Research Council in Brussels, the main responsive mode European research funding agency, where it's recently appointed head Mara Ferrari, an Italian-American scientist, tried in response to COVID-19 to sort of tack very rapidly and hard the ERC's emphasis to COVID-19, and this was met with significant resistance from the Council of the European Research Council, who felt that was not the role of the ERC, which was to be investing in these longer-term big questions, and there were other factors at play in terms of why they all fell out. But anyway, he quit as a result of this. So that's a particularly visible sign of how these tensions can manifest. But much more broadly, there's this sort of issue about how research funders, how research systems respond, which clearly they have to the magnitude of this in a range of ways, but do so in a way that avoids the trap, the pitfall of what some have called COVIDization of the research system. So, sort of everything kind of being skewed towards both the immediate pandemic or pandemic-related research. And again, I pulled here a very nice article by Matthias Egger, who is the head of the Swiss National Science Foundation, from a couple of weeks ago, where he reaffirms that from their perspective as the Swiss National Funding Agency, they are still as committed to problems and challenges across the board, not just to COVID-19 or to pandemics in particular, and they really do want to encourage still the kind of investigator-led, responsive modes of funding that they have, they put a lot of emphasis on. And it's interesting for him to say that in particular, because I mean, as well as heading the SNSF, he's also the chair of the Swiss National Task Force responding to COVID. So he's right at the heart of that area of research, but is also, I think, in an admirable way, trying to lift the sights of the funding system, the research system, to some of these bigger, longer term challenges. Here in the UK, we're of course in a week where we're going to hear a lot more, both from PM Today and I think the R&D roadmap we're expecting to be published, if may then in the next couple of days, which will offer more detail, and it will also ask some questions, as I understand, I haven't seen the document, about how the UK allocates the additional investment in research that has been promised now by the government. So they'll be reaffirming this aspiration to move public funding in the UK from its current level of around 11.5 billion pounds a year to 22 billion pounds a year by the end of this Parliament, which is of course a very significant increase, and they hope to see private sector R&D increase alongside. But the roadmap will be an attempt to try and look at that increase and think about how new money is allocated. So in a way, that is a brilliant site for testing the balance of broader versus more specific, directed versus responsive, obviously geographic and other factors as well at play in terms of the levelling up agenda. So we're sort of in an interesting time in domestic R&D funding to sort of see how this plays out. And of course, as well, within that, I don't think it'll be a very prominent part of the roadmap, still lingers the question as to how, if we remain as the UK part of Horizon Europe, the pan-European funding schemes in some associated capacity, which many would see as a logical consequence of the pandemic, in that it clearly highlights the need for scientific collaboration in response to big challenges. But of course, there may be political resistance to that from some quarters in government. Okay, so that's funding, three waves. I'll talk more quickly about outputs and culture, and there's loads one could say. And I should say it's really fascinating. I mean, not only has there been a huge amount of research done on COVID, but there's also now a growing amount of research on COVID. So it's a sort of a sort of exciting time to be looking at these questions, even if it is always with a bit of alarm and uncertainty. But in terms of outputs, there have been various studies on this published in recent weeks. I'm going to highlight one from Digital Science because they're a partner in Rory. It's a nice openly available study you can get that they published the other day. So this looks at how the pandemic is changing research culture, but particularly, as you'd expect, because they're drawing on the Dimensions database, looks at outputs of various kinds. And you see here in this graph from that report the very significant and rapid growth that we saw as the pandemic escalated through February and March and into April, in the volume and proportion overall of the volume of articles, and I should say this is COVID-related research. This isn't all research, but the volume and the proportion of research that was being published in the form of preprints and conference proceedings, as opposed to peer-reviewed articles. And this is a reflection of the kind of thing that the New York Times article I showed earlier was also pointing to, the significant scale of response seen in the publishing system to all of this. So to give a bit more detail from the Digital Science figures, as of 1st of June, which when they published the report, there were upwards of 42,700 scholarly articles on COVID-19 published, over 3,000 clinical trials, 420 data sets, etc. Preprints are, by the time we got to May 2020, were accounted for around a quarter of those outputs. So that's a very significant shift. And of course, we've also seen the publishers moving both individually and in concert, as with this initiative here, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, to try and accelerate review processes linked to COVID-19 research, and also to make any research that's relevant to the crisis open, even if it wasn't open access before. For some, they've made it open permanently. For others, they've made it open for a period. But it's definitely initiated a big shift. And of course, this is a very interesting area in the sense that one both applauds those efforts and welcomes them, but it also raises quite profound questions. What is it about COVID-19 that triggers publishers to move at that speed and in that way, but doesn't necessarily happen with climate change, if framed as a climate emergency? What is it? How bad does a crisis have to be before publishers, lower the paywalls, as it were? But there are positive dimensions to this as well to reflect upon. There is at the same time, and again, everyone be aware of this, a sort of negative strand to all of this, a concern that speed, positive as it may be, can also bring its own challenges and problems. And we see this, of course, in concern over a sort of rush to publish poor quality research. The Lancet paper on hydroxychloroquine was a particularly prominent example of if you like, sort of shoddy research or failed to declare interest, etc., that had made its way into the published sphere. And we've seen a lot of again, statements and work by various people on this challenge. There's a good position piece published there by the UK Reproducibility Network that I think captures well this sort of dilemma between obviously wanting to welcome aspects of the accelerated and more open sharing of findings and data, but also express concern about a relaxation of some of the normal protocols and controls that we'd want to see in high quality research. Culture, again, the same kind of thing is at play. You've got, in a way, I suppose, unsurprisingly, under the conditions of the pandemic, we see all of the best and all of the worst of research, but in a very concentrated form, the good and the bad. So we have already now a growing body of evidence indicating serious effects of the pandemic and the lockdown, as it were, particularly on research productivity in a very gendered way. The burden, of course, falling far more heavily and unfairly on both women and those with caring responsibilities. I speak as someone with 4 kids of my own, none of whom have been to school since mid-March. So as you would expect, publishers, it's very interesting. You talk to publishers and the volume of research they're getting in, not just in COVID areas, but across the board, has gone up. So there definitely are, as the Nature piece there points to, the pandemic is not an extended sabbatical. There definitely are those of our colleagues who are to their good fortune, as it were, using this time to write more, publish more, etc. But there are many others for whom that's just impossible, given all of the other pressures that attach to homeschooling and even just putting 3 meals on the table every day, etc. So these are really, really serious issues, and it's hard. We can recognize this problem. Another study up there at the top, done by Dash and Wang and others in the US, shows the same issue, that having children is the biggest determinant in terms of reduced productivity. So we can recognize the problem, but what do we do about it as funders, as university managers, as publishers? Because our system isn't good at taking account of these sorts of factors. One of the big critiques that we've all used, myself included, of metrics and other proxies of performance. You look at the data and it won't, especially in 5 years' time, it won't take account of a 6 month, or maybe it'll be 9 months, who knows, if there's a second wave, a year more of disrupted home and work life from this. And so it's very important that we think this through. And I very much welcome and applaud efforts by DORA, the San Francisco Declaration, and others, to try and encourage funders and universities and others to really put serious thought into the systems they're using for appraisal and promotion and hiring at this time, so that we don't just bake in all sorts of further inequalities that of course existed before the pandemic but are being again magnified and worsened by it. The same applies of course to all the rapid and agile funding. The question is, who are the people who've got the time to be writing all these grant applications to get this money? And I think that's another feature of the same problem. So there's all of that needs serious thought. The other interesting, and this is a bit more tentative, but I've just pulled another slide here from digital science and a sort of economist cover to go with it. In this condition where, of course, none of us can travel around, even though we're all doing stuff as we are now here on screens, it's interesting to reflect on whether we're going to see a reduction in the volume of collaborative international research. And there's just beginning to be some signs of this in some of the data here. You see it in this graph here as a proportion, again, of this is, again, COVID-related research. Caroline Wagner in the US has done a bit of work on this. I think it's too early to sort of call this one in terms of research across the board, but you very obviously could see longer term, especially if you have no travel and conferences for 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, a visible effect in collaborative patterns of publication. And of course, we know that collaborative publications tend to be higher impact, even though those measures of impact may be problematic. Okay, finally, how can research on research help us make sense of this? I mean, I'm not here to push Rory as a particular, but I think for any of work on research policy systems, governance, this situation that we're in is obviously with challenges and concerns, but also with possibilities to try and better understand these dynamics, and as I said at the start, to draw from them lessons and insights that can help us in our longer term goal of strengthening research systems and cultures, ensuring a more diverse and inclusive research system, thinking about the modes and the bureaucratic processes attached to funding, etc. Using some of these mechanisms for experimentation, and in that way trying to bounce back to something better. So, I don't at all pretend that we have any of these answers yet. I think it's a very important research agenda, and I think we need to ensure that we are thinking about it, longer term than simply the sort of first or second wave consequences of this. So, I hope I haven't gone too far over my time, but I will stop there and invite any comments or questions. Thank you.
That was great. I've got a couple of questions, and if anybody wants to start sending their questions or raising their hand, and we'll put those questions forward. So I've got a question from Ruth. She says, if there's going to be increased funding towards R&D, do you think that this would stem the financial impact on universities as a result of the fall in students taking up university courses? Should universities be investing more in research staff and students?
Yes, that's a very, very acute question here in the UK, well, and in any system that has a heavy reliance on cross subsidy of income from international students to research. I mean, Australia is a similar system in that respect. I think, if we focus on the UK, which obviously what one could describe with the most detail, I mean the stabilisation package, as it was termed, that we saw issued at the weekend, it came out on Friday night from the government and from UKRI, is a very welcome attempt to try and limit the negative effects of what will of course be a big drop in, we're expecting to be a big drop in student income, certainly internationally, potentially also domestically. So to sort of limit those effects on the research system. And I think, it's quite a complicated package. Those that have looked at it in terms of, it's a combination of sort of three elements: an additional tranche of money to help to extend grants and support research projects that have been disrupted by the pandemic, in the way I was describing earlier. So that's about 200 million, and 80 million also coming through UKRI that will go towards priority R&D areas. So they could be, I guess, the back end of wave one in my terms, and certainly wave two. And then the bigger element of it is the promise of long-term low interest loans that the government will underwrite for universities to apply for. as a way of spreading the pain, whether it's a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year period of pain, over a longer period. So I think that will be helpful. It will go a long way, and I think it's very welcome. If you total it all up, it's probably not a long way off the extra billion or so that was part of the original unsuccessful asks from Universities UK. I think it's quite hard, as of today, to understand exactly how those different streams will wash through the balance sheet of a given university. They're clearly weighted towards the intensives, these measures, but those tend to be the most exposed to international students. So I think it's an attempt to try and put money directly in the areas where research could be affected. The thing that's harder to predict is the effect of all of this on the wider flexible movement of money across the university system that we see. So, at an institutional level, there's a heavy reliance within universities on being able to move money around quite freely and flexibly. It's that's going to be much harder in this environment. So I think that will inevitably have negative effects on some areas of research, even with the measures that the government's now introduced. What happens with the new money from the government is the more open question. This brings us back to the R&D roadmap, because there is a sort of tension or even paradox at the heart of this government's position. Universities, on the one hand, they are very supportive of science, and we'll see again this week in PM's speech today, lots of both rhetorical and actual support for science and research in terms of increased finance, but also a very, very uncomfortable dynamic in terms of the government's relationship with the universities as a class of institution. And of course, in the UK, our research system is the public research system, at least not private sector R&D, is primarily delivered through universities. So this is a difficult, dilemma, as it were, for the government. It's going to increase research funding a lot. Is it comfortable putting large parts of that through universities? And this is where this whole move towards new institutions, Dominic Cummings' proposal for an ARPA, and various other measures comes in. So, we don't really know at this point what all of that extra money. I mean, on the face of it, an extra, doubling of public funding for R&D is great news for universities. But in practice, I'm not sure it's quite as straightforward as that. You're muted, Jenny.
Sorry, have you got me?
Yeah.
Okay, so you touched on the rush to publish issue. Would you be able to expand on the implications for the wider open research agenda? Are there any lessons to learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point I sort of briefly touched on is the really interesting one. What is it about this crisis that has both necessitated and legitimized, create the sort of open the Overton window, if you want to put it in those terms, for the publishing industry to open up and do things in a new way. And of course, it's a very, we all recognize the severity of the crisis in in a very obvious sense, but one could make the case for other equivalently alarming and worrying challenges that we face. Climate is perhaps one of the best examples, but there are many others with respect to poverty and all sorts of persisting and long-term problems that are with us that haven't triggered this kind of response from the publishing system. And so I think that's the really interesting sort of question to reflect on, both for the publishing industry, but also for researchers as a community. Similarly, in terms of research sort of publishing pathways, I think for those who have been perhaps for the first time, certainly with more intensity, drawn down the path of preprints and more rapid publishing platforms of various kinds as a result of the urgency of this crisis, will they be comfortable reverting to a model where research sits stuck in peer review for a longer period? I mean, this is again a question to I think it's too early to call the extent to which the system will sort of revert to normal, or this will be more disruptive. I hope in many respects, I mean, as someone who's in favour of open research, that it is more disruptive of some of this, but I recognise that's not always straightforward, and of course we need to, as always with these debates, balance innovation and disruption with the need to maintain a economically viable scholarly communication system.
Great. Okay.
Question just flashed up from the one on social science there. I'm just hang on, let me just
Got it.
how do I get the text box up? I've lost it again. Someone just asked, riffing off something Michael Gove had said earlier this week, will we see, do we expect to see more of a shift away from social science, humanities research, etc. I think again, it's a bit.
Oh, I think we've lost you.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, in the social science humanities on social media, I think over the weekend, was saying, well, this is bad news for us, but it's actually, I think, not really, because it's in the STEM areas where the biggest effects are going to be felt in terms of the cost base of those subjects, etc. So I think in terms of the stabilizing money, it's the goal still is primarily stabilizing the system. Where there's much more to play for is clearly in the new money, the extra 11 billion a year, as well, or the road towards that over the next 3-4 years. And this is where the R&D roadmap comes in. So I think it's not clear. We know that this government has at various times, and Michael Gove in particular, perhaps, been somewhat hostile to aspects of the social sciences. That said, you've seen in COVID-19, as in other similar crises, the need for a plural inter-transdisciplinary response. So I very much welcome the effort by the British Academy and others over the last few weeks to launch. They've launched this thing called the SHAPE initiative to try and group together social science, humanities, arts subjects in a new umbrella term like STEM, and use that as a way of making the case more strongly for them as a sort of group within the system. So I hope there are more such efforts. I mean, personally, as someone who's always worked across disciplines and worked a lot with natural physical scientists, I mean, I find it always saddening and disappointing when these things are tensioned in a sort of zero-sum way. But I recognise that at some level, all of this is a bit of a battle for resource. I think the final thing I'd say on this is, of course, it remains to be seen whether the aspiration for UKRI as an integrated agency to really transcend some of these historic divisions across the research council can be fully realised. And among all the other announcements in R&D this week, we've seen also Ottilie Loza take up her post as the new chief exec of UKRI as of yesterday. And of course, it'll be interesting to see whether she and her colleagues sort of manage to drive further forward the efforts that have already been made to try and move in that direction. But I think there's still quite a lot of it, structurally, quite a lot of difficulty in doing that at a large scale across the current UKRI system.
Yep. So we've got a question from Ogden. Oh, another one's just come through. Let's see. So Adam says, good to hear some funders expressing support for investigator-led non-COVID funding. I worry about the COVID crowbar distorting research priorities, both in terms of how grant applications pitch, frame, orientate their work, and what gets funded. Finding a balance will be a challenge. No question in there, but maybe you want to comment?
Well, yeah, no, I completely. I mean, that's the point of sort of COVIDization features. Yeah, I mean, that's clearly going to be a challenge, here as elsewhere. So I think all we can do is try and raise awareness of that, understandable dynamic in any system response to this, and try and ensure that it doesn't go so too far that it becomes distorting. I mean, clearly we do want more, I think, money going into pandemic related research as a result of this, so no one's arguing against that. As ever, though, it's an issue of balance. And I mean, I again raise the spectre of Martin Rees's asteroid strike as a sort of way of underlining that point.
I think we've got time for one more question, so if you can answer briefly. Matt says, to what extent does the new UKRI chief exec bring a new vision?
Well, Matt has, of course, until recently been on the council of the ESRC, probably as well placed to answer this as me. I mean, I think we don't know yet. Of course, she only literally started work yesterday, so it would be perhaps unfair to expect a fully formed vision on day two. We know with Ottiline that she's someone who has both written and advocated extensively in the past on issues of research culture. She chaired an influential Nuffield Council on bioethics report on research culture 5 or 6 years ago that was very well received, and she's done a lot to advance those agendas in a range of settings, including the Royal Society, and I think in her own lab. I mean, you talk to people who work in the Sainsbury lab at Cambridge, and they will say, one of the most positive, encouraging signs, as it were, of her taking over is they say, well, she really does put this stuff into practice in the culture and sort of operating environment of the lab where she works. Is it possible to sort of scale up and do that across the entire UKRI system? I think is the harder question, because of course UKRI is a very big beast with many moving parts, and it can be a challenge to drive change, or at least encourage and coax change through large organizations of that kind. So I think, say, on day two is we wish her all the best in achieving that, and I think it's important that we all try and pull together to help her in efforts to do so, as I'm sure all the people in UKRI will be doing. You're muted again, Jenny, sorry.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was just saying we're going to finish up. If anybody has any other questions, perhaps they could email you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I should say Rory's very interested in this stuff. We're very interested in working with others who want to both ask and answer these questions. So do ping me an email if you have any thoughts. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for everyone for coming and listening. Thank you to our speaker, James Wilston.
Great. Thanks, Jenny.
And there'll be a recording available as well, if anybody wants to hear it again.
Excellent. Thank you.
There we go.